Did you know that cultural conditioning is one of the most important subjects that nobody is talking about? And did you know that where you slept in the first 2 years of your life shapes the way you learn and solve problems today? What are linear active, multi-active, and reactive cultures? And how should we deal with culture shock? I am Kevan Nikchu, and in today's episode, we cover cultural conditioning. I've always been fascinated by this question. How much do we get influenced by our surroundings and our culture and our upbringing? Would it be 30%, 50%, 80%, or maybe even 90%? Well, I think in my case, it's around 70%. You see, in my mind, however, is a fluctuating mass that think it's free 100%. But in fact, I think this is just my opinion, by the way. I think it's just free about 50%. And the other 50% are chained to my cultural conditioning. You see, I think we perceive our minds to be unshackled, but just like a writer or a prisoner, a broadcaster, or an artist, our minds have been thoroughly indoctrinated. Sometimes in purpose, often not. And this is what cultural scientists call collective conditioning. Collective conditioning refers to the process by which societal norms, beliefs, and values are instilled in individuals within a community or society. It involves the transmission of cultural expectations, behaviors, and attitudes from one generation to the next through various social institutions such as family, education, religion, media, and of course, the government. And in many countries, surprisingly, actually, football influences a lot of this. This conditioning shapes the way people perceive the world around them and influences their thoughts, actions, and interactions with others. It includes both explicit rules and implicit cultural norms, often operating at a subconscious level. You see, collective conditioning plays a significant role in shaping societal cohesion, identity, and stability. However, it can also perpetuate biases, stereotypes, and inequalities if not critically examined and challenged. Recognizing and understanding collective conditioning is essential for promoting cultural awareness, fostering empathy, and building more inclusive and equitable societies. Collective conditioning within our society, initiated in an infancy and reinforced in primary education, school, and professional environment, convinces us of our normalcy while deeming others eccentric. In this podcast series, I will share what is culture, what makes it so important, what makes it work, and I'll be profiling the cultures of nearly 60 countries. Yeah. And again, here is a damn word we keep hearing all the time, culture. Well, what is it exactly? I think culture is a byproduct of consistent behavior. Let me repeat that. I love this line. Culture is the byproduct of consistent behavior. Culture is action rather than just words. And if you encourage people to share, then sharing will become built in your culture. If you reward trust, then trust will be built into your culture. If you treat your employees to bonuses after hard work, then guess what? Hard work will be idolized for its rewards. Which is why I don't think culture is created. It just happens. This is where many corporates and new startups kind of suck at. When they say, yeah, we're building a great culture. Human, please, you aren't building shit. You are forcing it. Just like, a culture isn't ping pong table and casual Fridays. Those are objects and events, not culture. And it's definitely not just a slogan. Just like fine whiskey, you got to let the time develop culture. When new parents bring their little bundle of joy home from hospital for the first time, they need to make a very important decision on where the baby will sleep the first months or years of his or her life. In Spain, it's pretty common for the baby to bunk up with parents, usually snuggled close to the mom for maybe first year or two. But across the waters in Britain and America, it's a different story. babies often get their sleeping space either right away or after a bit of time. Now, you might be wondering, what's the big deal here? Surely it doesn't matter where a baby sleeps. Well, it turns out that this early sleeping arrangement can have some interesting implications for how the child learns to navigate the world, from their sense of dependence or independence to how they tackle problem solving when they grow up. And I think the impacts of this is not as widely understood as it should. I'm on a side mission to help people understand how different scenarios in raising your children has a long-lasting impact on their success, health, and relationships. More about this in later episodes though. So, it's only natural for parents and teachers to want to give their kids the best advice possible, right? They're trying to set them up for success in their own culture, where things like knowing the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, and what's considered normal or not are pretty clearly cut out. Every culture group has its own way of doing things. It's like their own set of rules that they need to follow. And you know what? Each one is totally valid in its own context. But I think when we grow up, these cultural norms get embedded deep into our brains and becoming almost impossible to shake off. And that's when things get interesting and weird. And this is the part of our lives that I want to get into with more detail. You see, we start seeing people from other cultures as a bit odd or quirky, simply because they do things differently than we do. I mean, just look at how different the Greeks are from Hawaiians, right? But despite their differences, there's still this idea floating around that deep down we're all pretty much the same. Sure, there are some universal traits that we all share, but they're not as common as you might think. Our national programming kind of messes with our instincts, shaping them in ways that might surprise you. Take the Dutch, for example. They're known being for being really cheap and almost without any sort of distinguishable culture, while Mexicans are more on the free spending side and have a strong identifiable culture that is simply captivating and replicated around the world. So why does this happen? Well, it's easy to generalize, but in case of Mexico, one can easily argue that their culture is captivating due to their few factors, like their music, sunny smiles, flavors of their food, and the climate. By the way, climate is a huge factor in culture. Dutch have famously a rainy climate, windy climate, which leads to kind of bland food and bland music and so on. But they do obviously have their parties and fun. But what I get fascinated by is culture shock. When we visit or move to another country, we often experience a culture shock. I love a good culture shock. It makes me feel alive and traveled. But what is it exactly? Well, culture shock is the disorientation and discomfort that individuals experience when they encounter unfamiliar cultural norms, values, and behaviors in a new or different cultural environment. It's that feeling of being out of place, like you've suddenly landed on a different planet where everything seems strange and unfamiliar. So when people are exposed to culture that is vastly different from their own, it can be quite a shock to the system, right? You've seen this. You've definitely encountered this. I had this many times. But suddenly things that were once familiar and routine that was familiar becomes so confusing and challenging. I think that from the moment people communicate and interact with social norms and customs, every aspect of daily lives can feel foreign and bewildering. Symptoms of culture shock, which I'm sure you've encountered, can vary from person to person, but often include the feelings of frustration, anxiety, loneliness, and even depression. In my case, sometimes like anger, like, why are they doing this like this here? But it's like being thrust in a whole new world without a map or guidebook, and navigating through it can be incredibly daunting. However, with time and effort, just like anything else, most people are able to adapt to their new cultural surroundings and overcome culture shock quite quick. They learn to understand and appreciate the differences and finding ways to bridge the gap between their own cultural background and the new one they're immersed in. It's a challenging process, but ultimately it can lead to personal growth, increased cultural understanding, and a broader perspective on the world. You see, I was born in Iran, but I moved to Finland when I was just about 6 years old, 7 years old. And Finland could not be more different than to Iran. And it's a very interesting country. There's a feeling of respect and order over there. Everywhere you go is always order and respect. Everything starts on the time agreed. Things are transparent. What they say is their bond, and what they promise will be delivered. And after Finland, I moved to New York City, which could not be more opposite to a small Helsinki. Anyone who's been in New York will admit to a few things about the city. The smell is horrible. The noise is, wow, it's overwhelming. And the amount of people is just staggering. The rudeness of them is also quite shocking. And the amount of cars and buildings is just absolutely insane. But it's safe to say that I had a big culture shock when I landed to New York. But it only took me kind of like 2 or 3 days to get over it. And on the third day or fourth day, I was integrated and ready to hustle, man. I loved it over there. But after New York, I moved to London, which was another mega city, but on a different scale. London can be menacing. With cars driving on the wrong side, to the sheer size of its size. I mean, London is expansive, not like a high rise like New York. It's just really wide. And the public transportation system is really confusing. And it was so expensive to me after New York. So it was another culture shock that it took a longer time to actually recover. I was quite depressed for the first 2 weeks when I lived there, maybe even a month. I hated it in there. The apartments were small. It was rainy all the time. Food was crap. It was humid inside. Everything was expensive, and it was super dark at night. But after a couple of 3 weeks, or maybe even 4 weeks, I got going like a fox on cocaine. I was a Londoner. After a few months, I even had the accent. But after 2 years of living in London, I had enough. And I decided to go and study. And I went to study in Stirling, in Scotland. Now, this country gives everyone a big culture shock, no matter where you're from. Even if you're from Wales or England or Ireland, Scotland will shake you. Now, why? You arrive to Scotland and immediately you're faced with insane accent. It actually sounds like a different language to English. Their accents is so rough. It's like, all right, pal, what are you doing here? Yeah, hey, what's your name then? All right, brilliant. And everyone is an outlander to them, even the English. And if you're English, well, I'm sorry, it's going to be really rough in the beginnings. But Scottish are amazing people. They're so understanding of their roughness and the culture, and explain it to you. And they really want to get you to love Scotland, and they make all the efforts to it. So they made my experience very well, very good. And I studied there for 4 years, and I fell in love with Scotland. I love that place. After Scotland, after graduating, I moved to Bahrain. I went there with my girlfriend and my friends, and even being from Middle East, but after being in Scotland, Bahrain was the biggest culture shock to me. It was so hot. There were more Indians than the Arabs. There were a lot of Pakistanis. There were like slave laborers everywhere you go. Everywhere there was construction sites, and there were just Indians working in 40 degrees heat. It was just insanity. And everything was all the time, yes. Nobody will say no to you. Like every question you had was like, yes, I can do that. And then they end up not being able to do anything. So Bahrain is an interesting, just like Dubai, there's many cultures within it. It's like you have the Shia, you have the Sunnis, you have the immigrants, you have the hierarchies, you have the sheikhs, you have the all kinds of different levels. And you need to know how to deal with them. And it was really kind of like really sad to see someone really low level, like Indians coming over, and they made like €1 a day maybe, and not even that. Whereas, you know, foreigners like Australians, British, and etc., they will make like 100 times more that and more a day. And you know, that took a while. And it took a while for me because I was not coming from a culture which is so hierarchical where I feel superior to others. But this one, for the first time, I actually was forced to feel superior to others, and it was a culture shock, and I will explain that later. Then after Bahrain came Berlin. I moved to Berlin, which was a dream of mine. I always loved Germany, and I always wanted to live in Berlin, and that was amazing. I got back to my Nordic, kind of like Nordic roots, and I saw order, and I saw a lot of nature, and there was no hierarchies. There was just bustling everywhere, music everywhere. There was no more overbearing heat, and And you know, when Germans say something starts at the time it starts, whereas in Bahrain it's like if you meet someone at 12 o'clock, they will come at 12:40 or 12:30, and they won't even apologize. They were like, why did you expect me to come at 12 o'clock? Even when you greet, where with the Germans it's like 12 o'clock, it expect you to be there 5 minutes or 10 minutes before, you know, because that just means a meeting starts at 12, but 10 minutes before is when you actually sit down maybe and get some small talk out of the way. But 12 o'clock is when the action starts, and they expect it to start and end exactly the time you agreed. And I love that. I love the order. I love the Ordnung that Germans are very famous for. And I will go through German culture more in deep detail later on in this series. After Berlin, by the way, living in Berlin with Germans, wow. I will talk about this. It was fantastic, and it was really weird, and it was educational. I have so many stories to tell. After Berlin came Madrid. We lived in Madrid for a while. Now Madrid is, wow, it is, if you've never been there, you should go. It's completely different to Barcelona or Valencia or Mallorca or Tenerife. Madrid is the capital of a massive, massive empire. And now Spain, no matter what you think, has an empire of mind, that is, empire of culture, that is. I don't know about you, but I think everyone I met in the world loves, in some extent, the Spanish. And Madrid is in the center of that, you see. And it's a city of 3 million people. And it is loud. It is so lively. It is the center of the commerce in Spain, sports, art. It's really wealthy. It has a huge hierarchical system where you have the pijos, which are the posh people on the top of the chain, with aristocrats and a lot of people from other areas of Spanish culture. Then you have the immigrants in the low end, which are, you know, different kinds of immigrants, by the way. The Moroccans are categorized as different. They're not even immigrants, they're just Moros, which means the Moors. And then you have Latin American immigrants, then you have European immigrants, then you have Eastern European immigrants, then you have Chinese immigrants. These are all categorized in Spain as different immigrants. Now, living in Madrid was a very, very incredible experience. I lived there for 8 years, and I don't know what it is about that city that grabs you. There is no way you can live in that city and not be influenced by the culture. Now, it's easy to live in Dubai and Bahrain and not be influenced by culture. You see, a lot of people I met in Dubai or Bahrain, especially British or Americans or Australians, would live there for many years, even 10 years, and not speak a word of Arabic. You can't get away with that in Germany, in Spain. It's impossible. Maybe even in Germany, but in Spain, there's no way. So living in Madrid, you get incredibly indoctrinated in their culture. You know, it's Spain, it's music everywhere. Food is incredible. And it's available all the time. The language has to be spoken. Almost nobody wants to or speaks English. I mean, they do, of course. There's many, many educated people. It's a very educated city. But they prefer you to speak in their language because that's when they can be free. And that makes sense. I will talk about Madrid and Spain in depth when I cover Spain in my episodes. But then after Madrid comes Amsterdam, and that's where I'm living now, and that's where I'm recording this to you right now. And Amsterdam, I've lived here now for 5 years, and this city has, for me, changed my life. It's opened my chakras, my soul, my eyes, my mind to everything. I think it's also the timing of where I'm, like, on my age. I'm now 40, and I am mature. I learn more quicker. But what's happening in Amsterdam to me is something I never experienced before. I'm becoming more open-minded. I'm embracing change. I am much more flexible. I'm not so reactive. I'm not so impulsive as I've been before. I understand different perspectives, and I become understanding of cultures, and I'm listening in deeper, and I'm leaning into conversations, and I'm asking the different and right questions, and I'm making friends from different backgrounds, different scales of the society, and this is giving me a completely different perspective in life. And I will talk about this also more in deep when I cover Netherlands in the next episodes. But all my travels and all my lives where I lived in different countries, I noticed that in each country, time had a different meaning, right? For instance, a Lebanese guy who I would meet a lot, but this is not one Lebanese guy, there's many of them, but almost all of them that I met in my life so far would arrive like 30 minutes late for a scheduled meeting. For example, in Bahrain, I remember that first Lebanese guys, I met them, they would just come 30 minutes late. to a meeting, and I was sitting with the other Arabs, and nobody would even raise an eyebrow when the guy will come like 30 minutes late. I was like, what is this? However, where he arrived 30 minutes late in a foreign culture, let's say in Austria, I think there will be quite a lot of rejection from Austrians if a guy will come 30 minutes late to a meeting, right? But German speakers in general detest being kept waiting, even for 5 minutes, let alone 30. I remember living in Berlin, being late 5 minutes at doctor's appointment meant the slot was given to someone else. It was brutal, but it made me be on time, yeah? That's what I love about Germans. And Germans aren't exactly congenial cultures, though. You know what that is? Congenial culture? I'll be talking about this quite a lot, so it's worth to elaborate what this is. Congenial culture refers to cultural environment or setting that is kind of pleasant, friendly, and agreeable to you and me, individuals. It's like being in a place where you feel comfortable, where people are welcoming and the atmosphere is relaxed. And relaxed is the key word here. You know, Mediterraneans, Scandinavians, Middle Easterns, Indians, and maybe even Australians are like congenial cultures. In a culture like that, there's a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect among members. People tend to get along really well, and interactions are characterized by warmth and positivity. It's the kind of environment where you feel like you belong, where you can be yourself without the fear of any judgment or hostility. And that's what I like about these cultures. In a more congenial cultural setting, say France, especially South France, criticism may be veiled in cynicism, but it's less definitive or damning. For example, my favorite is when French say after hearing your bullshit, which has happened to me a lot, like after hearing your bullshit. I remember my friends would say like, my friend, you just stole 20 minutes of my life. And then off goes the Frenchie. I love that about them. The Spanish, arriving 30 minutes late in the first meeting, now is more attuned to Latin sensibilities, arrives only 20 minutes late next time. The Frenchman, not particularly punctual himself, eventually settles for 15 minutes next time. The Italian concurs, and such is the way of Latin understanding. And this is why we love the Latins. So who in this world is normal anyway? Right? Most English people consider themselves the epitome of normalcy, viewing all others, whom they often label as foreigners, as abnormal, adequate, perhaps but incapable of thinking and acting like a true Englishman, simply because, well, they're foreign, innit? But people in Spain, Italy, France, or any major tourist country would argue the opposite about the English. And then we have the Americans, our favorite troublemakers. Americans, I know you're listening, I have my close friends Americans, and Americans believe USA reigns supreme in the world. They think they're the biggest, the best, the newest, the richest, the fastest, and they view all others as a tad sluggish, antiquated, rather impoverished, or somewhat diminutive. And they're kind of not able to label the British as foreigners, so they resort to calling them limeys or whatever crap. Spaniards fancy themselves the bravest, owing their tradition to bullfighting and conquering the world, whereas the French perceive themselves as intellectually superior to all others, while Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese kind of harbor a conviction of their superiority over everyone, including the French. And Germans may concede because they're not as expansive as Americans, as nimble as the Japanese, or as eloquent as the French, or as polished as the British. But what truly matters in life for them is efficiency, punctuality, thoroughness, which they call Gründlichkeit, an obsession with methods, consistency, and organization. And let's be honest, who can match the Germans in these regards? That's why we love their cars, because they just work. Few countries exist where the populace doesn't believe deep down that they're the best, the most intelligent, or at least normal, yeah, right? In Europe, perhaps the Portuguese and the Estonians are the most innocent in this regard, often willing to critique themselves before others, yet still considering themselves normal. If individuals from each culture view themselves as normal, then it kind of follows that they perceive everyone else as abnormal, right? It makes sense. So by this logic, Swedish view Italians as excessively emotional to their gesticulations while speaking. Individualist Spaniards regard the Swiss as rigid and overly rubund, and vivacious Italians find Norwegians gloomy and boring. And French-influenced Vietnamese find Japanese impassive. And most South Americans find Argentinians overly dramatic and temperamental. Germans think Russians are unpredictable and very alcoholic, and Indians see straight-talking Americans as rude and unrefined. But we can achieve a good understanding of our foreign counterparts only if we realize that our cultural classes are coloring our view of them. So what is the route to better understanding each other? I think we need to begin by examining the special features of our own cultures. Our second task, once we realize that we do, too, are as trifle, strange, and is to understand the subjective nature of our ethnic and of our national values. While Scots see stubbornness largely as a positive trait, flexible Italians may see it as mainly intransigence, the diplomatic English possibly lack of artfulness or dexterity. But we can also make assumptions on the basis of our subjective view, and even worse, assumptions about other people's assumptions. The Italian assumes that French people can feel intellectually superior, also assumes that the French therefore thinks Italians are suitable mainly for manual labor when immigrating to France. Finnish people who judge Swedes as snobs also assume the Swedes stereotype Finns as rough and rustic. And I love the Nordics, by the way, because Swedish often express their feeling of safety because the Finns are next door, keeping away the unpredictable and violent Russians. Finns are considered the toughest of the Nordics, whereas the Danish are considered the softest. One of the best things I kept hearing from many Nordic people when I lived there, when it came to business, is this. You want the Finn to make the product, Norwegian to finance it, the Swedish to market it, and Danish to sell it. There may be a grain of truth in many of these judgments and assumptions, but the danger involved in making them is only too obvious. But this stereotyping and this sentence I just told you really paints the picture of how we perceive each other. And our perception of reality may be assisted if we can wear someone else's shoes for a moment. If we can see how he or she views some issues in a very different from how we see it. Let's take, for example, the different viewpoints of Finnish and Spaniards on legality and illegality. Both nationalities agree that trafficking in drugs is bad, and laws against drunken driver are socially beneficial and justified. But when it comes to restrictive immigration laws, the Finns' subjective view is that the fragile, delicately balanced national economy must be protected, while semi-consciously their instinct is to protect the purity of their race. Now, Spaniards, born in a country where no one dares to trace their ancestry more back than 1500s, have a reflective distaste for prohibitive immigration policies that hinder the free movement of Spaniards seeking better wages abroad. And such policies or laws they see as negative or simply bad. So it is by considering such matters that we realize that all that is legal is not necessarily good, and everything illegal is not necessarily bad. Swedish, the Swiss, the Germans do not make this discovery very easily. Although the latest cannabis ruling in Germany took me and probably many of you by complete surprise. Germany, out of nowhere, is now Europe's leading and most liberal country when it comes to cannabis. I mean, they can even possess 25 grams of cannabis on the person. Moving on, the Americans, Belgians, Hungarians, Koreans, and Australians can accept it without losing too much sleep. Latins, Arabs, Polynesians, Africans, and Russians see it clearly from the beginning. When I say what they see is that they see that the matter is that legal is not necessarily good and everything illegal is not necessarily bad. You see, stereotyping is dangerous, but generalizing is a fair guide at the national level. And all of us do stereotyping. It gives us some ground to work from. And here is where things for me get really interesting. And one of the main reasons I decided to do this podcast. Well, I used to read a lot about this guy called Richard Lewis, who is a cultural author who categorizes the world's cultures into 3 different groups. which are linear actives, multi-actives, and reactives. The linear actives are the planners, the list makers, the ones who like to take things one step at a time. They're all about schedules, timelines, and sticking to the plan. Think of it like following a recipe. You go step by step, measuring out each ingredient precisely to make the perfect dish. What nations come into mind when I say this? Well, linear actives are countries like Austrians, Germans, and the Swiss who are known for the linear active approach, where efficiency organizations are top priorities. Second ones are the multi-actives. These are the social butterflies, the ones who thrive on chaos and thrive on multitasking. They're the ones who can juggle a dozen things at once while chatting up a storm with whoever happens to be nearby. Like a bustling market where vendors are shouting over each other as someone is definitely playing loud music and customers are haggling left and right and chaos reigns supreme. But that's the multi-active lifestyle in a nutshell. These are countries like Italy, Iran, Spain, and Greece, etc., which are known for their multi-active approach, where relationships and social interactions take the center stage. And the third is the reactives, who are the listeners, the observers, the ones who like to sit back and take it all in before making a move. They're not the ones who to jump into action right away. Instead, they prefer to wait and see how things play out before making a decision. It's like playing a game of chess with them, where every move is carefully calculated and strategic. Countries like all the Nordics, China, Japan, and Korea are known for their reactive approach, where patience and contemplation are valued traits. But the real drama unfolds when different categories clash, not just nationalities. Take the Germans and the Dutch, for instance. Sure, they might butt heads now and then, but deep down, they get each other. Why is that? Well, because they're both cut from the same linear active cloth. Meanwhile, over in Korea and Japan, things can get downright frustrated between them. But hey, their mutual reactive culture somehow leads to blossoming trade relationships. Where it gets really interesting, even more than before, is the internal cultural differences within one country. And now, this is my favorite thing about cultures. You see, in many countries, probably yours, but in many countries like Spain, Iran, India, Italy, France, Germany, even England, there are huge differences amongst different regions and states. For example, in Spain, Andalusians who are in the south are the most multi-active people in Spain, who are known for the love of dancing, socializing, staying up late, and doing spontaneous things, whereas Asturians or Leonese, who are in the north of Spain, are linear actives. They like planning, taking things one step at a time, waking up early, working hard, and playing and saving the partying for the weekends. But the same applies to Sicilians and Lombardinos in Italy, Bavarians with Berliners in Germany, and so on and so on. But hey, in today's fast-paced global arena, being able to schmooze with people from all walks of life is the name of the game. Whether you're sealing deals, hashing out diplomatic agreements, or exchanging scientific know-how, having some cross-cultural fitness can take you to a lot of places. And nothing beats getting some hands-on experience in the international arena. It's like getting a crash course in cultural studies with a side of occasional jet lag. Now, you might be wondering, how many damn hats do I have to wear in order to make it in this world? Well, that's why I'm on a mission to navigate the world's cultures. There are 200 countries in the world, and each country has multiple cultures within. Surely, I can't be covering thousands of episodes of cultural explaining here. Well, I could actually, but it would take me years. And instead, what I'll do is bring this down to 60 countries. So every week, I'll be sharing my thoughts and my studies and my experiences on how to deal with certain countries such as USA, Canada, Britain, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Austria, and many, many, many more. And each week, I'll be sending more in-depth dives through my newsletter with detailed insights like charts, figures, real-life experiences, and like how to deal in meetings and what key messages to hear and what body language to look for. And you can find the Culture Explain newsletter at culturesplain.com. And that is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll join me for the next episode of Culture Explained. Have a sunny day.